Hello, and welcome to our channel, Stories with Silas. We hope you enjoy watching.
The blind woman's hands trembled, her son's voice dripped with contempt, and Layla had seconds to decide if her job was worth watching another human being vanish into silence. What she said next would either destroy her career or spark a movement that would reach 20 million people. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The hush that fell over Marcella's, one of Manhattan's most exclusive fine dining establishments, was different from the usual reverent quiet. This silence carried weight, discomfort, anticipation. Silverware clinked softly against bone china, waiters moved with practiced grace between linen-draped tables, and the soft notes of a string quartet drifted through the air like whispers. But at table 12, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Margaret Foster, 68 years old, sat rigid in her chair, her unseeing eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Her hands trembled slightly as they rested on the edge of the table, fingers searching for familiar landmarks in an unfamiliar world. She wore an elegant navy dress that her son had picked out, her silver hair swept back in a style she could no longer see in the mirror. 3 years ago, diabetic retinopathy had stolen her sight, and with it, much of her independence and joy. Across from her sat Khalid Foster, her son, though he'd legally changed his first name to Carter years ago when he entered the world of high finance. At 42, Carter was the picture of American success. Tailored Armani suit, a Rolex that cost more than most people's cars, and the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. He'd built his fortune in private equity, acquiring struggling companies, restructuring them ruthlessly, and selling them for massive profits. Forbes had called him the Vulture in their profile last year. He wore the nickname like a badge of honor. Tonight was Margaret's birthday. Carter had insisted on taking her to Marcella's, though his assistant had made the reservation, and his tone suggested obligation rather than celebration. He sat scrolling through his phone, responding to emails about a deal closing in Singapore, barely acknowledging his mother's presence. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her hands finding her water glass through careful exploration. She raised it to her lips, took a small sip, and set it down with exaggerated care. The world of the sighted moved so quickly around her, all rushing footsteps and distant conversations she couldn't quite follow. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Across the restaurant, 26-year-old Layla Chen watched table 12 with growing concern. She'd been a server at Marcella's for 2 years, working her way up from busser to one of their most trusted waitstaff. The job paid well enough to support her mother and younger sister in Queens, while she saved for graduate school. She'd learned to read people, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to move through the complex choreography of fine dining with grace. But something about table 12 made her pause. The older woman's isolation was palpable even from across the room. The way her son ignored her, the way she seemed to fold in on herself, shrinking despite her elegant bearing. Layla had seen demanding customers before, entitled billionaires who treated staff like servants, but there was something particularly cold about this man's indifference to his own mother. Marcus, the maitre d', approached Layla with the evening seating chart. "Table 12 is yours tonight," he said quietly. "The gentleman requested our most experienced server. He's apparently very particular." Layla nodded, straightening her black vest and checking her appearance in the reflection of a polished silver serving dome. She took a deep breath, centering herself the way her mother had taught her. In their family, respect for elders wasn't optional. It was fundamental. Looking at the lonely figure of Margaret Foster, Layla felt a familiar ache. Her own grandmother had lost her sight before passing away, and those final years had been marked by similar isolation, similar loss of dignity. She gathered her notepad and pen, but something made her pause. In her apron pocket she always carried a small notebook where she jotted down observations, details that might make a guest's experience special. Tonight she had a feeling she'd need more than the standard script of wine recommendations and specials. As she approached table 12, Layla had no idea that the next few hours would change everything. Not just for Margaret Foster, but for herself, for Carter, and eventually for thousands of people she'd never meet. Sometimes, the most profound moments begin with a simple act of seeing someone who has become invisible. "Good evening," Layla said, her voice warm and steady as she reached their table. "Welcome to Marcella's. My name is Layla, and I'll have the pleasure of serving you tonight." Carter barely glanced up from his phone. Margaret turned her head toward Layla's voice, and for just a moment something flickered across her face. Hope, perhaps, or the memory of hope. Carter finally looked up from his phone, his steel-grey eyes scanning Layla with the same assessing look he gave quarterly reports. He didn't smile, didn't acknowledge her greeting with anything resembling warmth. Instead, he gestured impatiently toward his mother. "My mother is blind," he said flatly, as if announcing a stock price. "Obviously she can't read the menu. You'll need to describe everything to her, every dish, every ingredient. And don't rush through it like you're reading a grocery list. She needs to understand what she's ordering." Margaret's face flushed pink. "Carter, please. I'm sure the young woman has other tables. I can just have whatever you're having." "No, Mother. You said you wanted to come here, so we're doing this properly." His tone carried the edge of someone who'd argued this point before, probably many times. There was something performative about his insistence, as though he was demonstrating his duty rather than expressing genuine care. Layla observed the exchange carefully. She noticed how Margaret's shoulders hunched slightly at her son's words, how her fingers gripped the edge of the table a little tighter. Years of serving taught Layla to read the subtle language of discomfort, and this woman was drowning in it. "Of course," Layla said gently, moving slightly closer to Margaret. "I'd be delighted to walk you through our menu, Mrs. Foster. We have some truly exceptional dishes tonight, and I think you'll find several that might interest you." Carter's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, and stood abruptly. "I need to take this call. It's Singapore. Make sure she orders something substantial. She barely eats anymore." He strode away toward the restaurant's entrance, phone already pressed to his ear, leaving his mother sitting alone at the table. The moment he left, Margaret seemed to deflate further. Her hands found each other in her lap, fingers intertwining nervously. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "He means well. He's just very busy. Important business deals and all that." Layla pulled out the chair beside Margaret and quietly sat down, bringing herself to the older woman's level. This wasn't standard protocol at Marcella's. Servers didn't sit with guests, but something in Layla's heart overrode the rules. "Mrs. Foster, there's no need to apologize," Layla said softly, "and there's no rush. Your son might be busy, but right now, this moment is just for you and me. Would it be all right if I describe the menu to you in a way that helps you really experience it?" Margaret turned her face toward Layla's voice, and for the first time that evening, something softened in her expression. "That's very kind of you. What's your name again?" "Layla. Layla Chen." "That's a beautiful name. Chinese?" "Half Chinese, half Mexican, actually. My mother's from Guangzhou. My father was from Mexico City." Layla smiled even though Margaret couldn't see it. Somehow, warmth carried in voices. "What a wonderful combination," Margaret said, and there was genuine interest in her tone, the first spark of life Layla had seen from her. "I used to love learning about different cultures. I was a history teacher for 37 years, ancient civilizations mostly, before—" She trailed off, her hand making a small gesture toward her eyes. "Before your sight changed," Layla finished gently, deliberately avoiding words like lost or gone. Her grandmother had hated when people spoke about her blindness as a loss, as if she herself had become less. Margaret's lips trembled slightly. Yes, before everything changed. Across the restaurant, Carter was still on his phone, gesturing emphatically as he spoke. Other diners glanced his way with mild annoyance. He was the kind of man who believed his time was more valuable than the peace of everyone around him. Layla made a decision in that moment. She could simply recite the menu efficiently, take Margaret's order, and move on to her other tables. That's what Carter expected. That's what the restaurant's protocols suggested. But sometimes protocol needed to bend for something more important. Sometimes a person needed to be seen, really seen, more than they needed efficient service. "Mrs. Foster," Layla said, her voice warm with purpose, "would you allow me to do something a little different tonight? Instead of just reading you the menu, I'd like to paint you a picture of each dish, to help you see it in your own way." Margaret's unseeing eyes glistened. She nodded, not trusting her voice. And so Layla began. Layla opened the leather-bound menu, but she didn't look at it. Instead, she watched Margaret's face, studying the subtle expressions that flickered across it like shadows on water. She'd learned from her grandmother that blind people often developed other ways of seeing, and she wanted to speak to those senses. "Let me start with our signature appetizer," Layla began, her voice taking on a different quality, softer, more textured, like she was sharing a secret. "It's called the Autumn Garden. Imagine standing in a garden at sunset in late September. The air has that crisp quality, where summer's warmth is just a memory. There's heirloom tomatoes, not the pale, flavorless kind from supermarkets, but the ones that taste like sunshine concentrated into fruit." Margaret's head tilted slightly, listening intently. "These tomatoes are deep red, some striped with gold and green, and they're sliced thick enough that you can feel their weight on your tongue. The chef roasts them slowly until their edges caramelize, bringing out a sweetness that's almost like honey, but with that bright acidity that makes your mouth water." "I can almost taste it," Margaret whispered. Layla smiled. "There's fresh burrata cheese nestled among the tomatoes. Do you know burrata? It's like mozzarella's more luxurious cousin. The outside has a delicate firmness, but when you cut into it, cream spills out, rich and buttery. It's the color of fresh snow, and it tastes like comfort." Margaret's hands had relaxed on the table. Her fingers were no longer gripping the edge, but resting gently open. "The chef adds basil that was picked this morning from the restaurant's rooftop garden. Not dried basil from a jar, but living leaves that still smell like sunshine in summer. When you bite into them, there's a slight peppery note, almost like clove. And then," Layla paused for effect, "there's a drizzle of aged balsamic vinegar, 25 years old. It's thick as syrup, dark as midnight, and when it touches your tongue, it's both sweet and sharp, like a memory that makes you smile and ache at the same time." Margaret's eyes were closed now, but not in the way of someone shutting out the world. She looked peaceful, present, like she was actually seeing the dish Layla described. "That sounds beautiful," Margaret said, her voice catching slightly. "I haven't thought about food that way in years. Since I lost my sight, eating has become so mechanical, just fuel, just getting through meals." "It doesn't have to be," Layla said gently. Carter reappeared at that moment, sliding back into his chair with barely a glance at either of them. "Still ordering? How long does it take to pick an appetizer?" He looked at his watch, a Swiss timepiece that probably cost more than Layla made in 6 months. "We're not rushing, dear," Margaret said, and there was something different in her voice now, a quiet firmness. Carter frowned, but pulled out his phone again, scrolling through emails. Layla continued, undeterred. "For the main course, we have several options, but there's one I think you might particularly enjoy, Mrs. Foster. It's our Colorado lamb." "I haven't had lamb in ages," Margaret said wistfully. "My late husband used to make it for special occasions. He'd roast it with rosemary from our garden. Layla felt her heart squeeze. She glanced at Carter, who showed no reaction to the mention of his father. He was typing furiously on his phone, completely disconnected from the conversation happening inches away from him. "This lamb is raised on a small family farm in Colorado," Layla continued. "Free range, fed on mountain grasses and wildflowers. The chef prepares it until it's medium rare, still blushing pink in the center, tender enough to cut with a fork. The outside has a crust of herbs. Rosemary, yes, but also thyme and lavender. Just a whisper of lavender, like walking past a flowering bush on a warm afternoon." Margaret's face had transformed. The tight lines around her mouth had softened. Her shoulders had dropped from their defensive hunch. She looked younger somehow, as if Layla's words were turning back time. "The lamb is served with what we call pomes Anna, potatoes, sliced paper thin, layered like the pages of a book, cooked in butter until they're golden and crispy on the outside, but melt in your mouth soft inside. And there's a sauce made from red wine reduction, so concentrated and rich it coats your tongue like velvet." "Stop," Margaret said suddenly. Layla froze, worried she'd gone too far. But Margaret was smiling, really smiling for the first time that evening. "I'll have that. The lamb. I haven't been excited about food in 3 years, and you just made me hungry for the first time in months." Carter looked up briefly. "Finally. I'll have the steak. Medium. Nothing fancy." But Layla barely heard him. She was watching a tear slide down Margaret Foster's cheek, not a tear of sadness, but something else entirely. Layla excused herself to place their orders, but something made her pause at the kitchen pass. She spoke quietly with Chef Antoine, a silver-haired man who'd trained in Paris and brought his artistry to Marcella's 10 years ago. She explained about Margaret, about her blindness, about the way food had become mere fuel instead of joy. Chef Antoine's eyes softened. "Tell me what she needs," he said simply. "I think she needs to feel special, to feel seen. Her son treats her like an obligation." The chef nodded slowly. "I understand. I will make her something to remember." When Layla returned to table 12, Carter was deep in conversation on his phone again, this time with the device propped against his water glass, on speaker, discussing quarterly projections with someone named Richard. He didn't bother excusing himself or lowering his voice. Margaret sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her face once again settling into that mask of patient endurance. Layla approached with a bread basket, but instead of simply setting it down, she leaned close to Margaret. "Mrs. Foster, may I describe our bread service for you?" Margaret's face turned toward her voice, grateful. "That would be lovely. We have 3 varieties tonight. In the front of the basket there's a sourdough that's been fermenting for 3 days. The crust crackles when you break it, you'll hear it, and inside it's chewy with these irregular holes like a sponge. It has a tangy flavor, almost sour, that wakes up your taste buds." As Layla spoke, she gently guided Margaret's hand to the basket. Margaret's fingers found the sourdough, and when she broke off a piece, the crust did indeed crack audibly. A smile flickered across her face. "Behind that, there's focaccia, an Italian flatbread. This one has been drizzled with olive oil and sprinkled with flaky sea salt and fresh rosemary. The top is golden and dimpled, like a quilted blanket. When you bite it, you get that herbaceous pine-like taste from the rosemary, and the salt crystals burst on your tongue." Margaret found the focaccia, her confidence growing. She was exploring the basket now, not helplessly waiting to be served. "And finally, there are these small rolls. We call them Parker House rolls. They're buttery and soft, almost sweet, like brioche, perfect for soaking up sauce." "You have such a gift," Margaret said quietly, "for making things come alive with words. You must be a writer or an artist." Layla laughed softly. "I'm saving for graduate school, actually. I want to study social work. Help people who've experienced trauma or loss rebuild their lives. That's wonderful, Margaret said with genuine warmth. Then her voice dropped lower, more hesitant. I suppose I should be the kind of person you'd work with. After I lost my sight, I also lost my purpose. I was a teacher. I loved my work. But everything changed, and I didn't know how to adapt. My late husband, Gerald, he would have known what to do. He always knew how to make things better. Carter's voice cut through their conversation. Mother, can you please not get so personal with the staff? I'm trying to have a business call here. The words landed like a slap. Margaret's face went rigid, the openness disappearing as quickly as it had emerged. Layla felt anger flash through her chest, hot and immediate, but she kept her expression neutral. My apologies, sir, Layla said, her voice professionally courteous, but with an edge that Carter was too self-absorbed to notice. I'll check on your appetizers. As she walked away, she heard Margaret's small voice. I'm sorry, dear. I didn't mean to embarrass you. You didn't embarrass me, Mother. You just need to remember where we are. Layla's hands trembled slightly as she checked with the kitchen. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, entitled, rude, demanding people who treated service workers as less than human. But there was something particularly cruel about Carter's treatment of his own mother, reducing her to a burden, an embarrassment, something to be managed rather than loved. The appetizers came up quickly. The autumn garden for Margaret, a simple Caesar salad for Carter, who'd ordered it without even asking what it was. Layla carefully arranged them on her tray and returned to table 12. This time, she didn't just set Margaret's plate down, she knelt beside her chair, bringing herself to the older woman's eye level, and in a voice meant only for Margaret, she described the placement of every element on the plate. Your tomatoes are at 12 o'clock, Mrs. Foster. The burrata is at 3 o'clock. There's a small pool of balsamic at 6 o'clock, and fresh basil leaves are scattered throughout like confetti. Margaret's hand found Layla's briefly, squeezing it. Thank you, she whispered, and in those two words was a universe of gratitude. Carter dug into his salad without a word, still scrolling through his phone with his free hand. But Margaret picked up her fork with something that looked almost like joy, and when she took her first bite, she closed her eyes and smiled in a way that transformed her entire face. For just a moment, she wasn't a blind woman, enduring her son's obligatory birthday dinner. She was simply a woman enjoying an extraordinary meal, seen and valued by someone who cared. As Margaret savored her appetizer, something remarkable happened. Other diners began to notice. A woman at table 7, celebrating her anniversary with her husband, watched with tears in her eyes as Layla knelt beside Margaret, patiently guiding her through each bite. An elderly couple at table 15 paused their own conversation to observe the tender interaction. Marcus, the maitre d', noticed too. He pulled Layla aside between courses, his expression unreadable. For a moment she worried she'd violated too many protocols, crossed too many professional lines. What you're doing, he said quietly, is exactly what this place should be about. Keep going. Layla felt relief wash over her. Thank you. That man, though, Marcus glanced at Carter, who was now on his third phone call of the evening. He's been here before, always on his phone, always impatient, never tips well despite his obvious wealth. But this is the first time he's brought anyone with him. I didn't realize that was his mother. Back at table 12, Margaret had finished her appetizer. Her plate was clean, every bite savored. She sat with her hands folded, a small smile playing at her lips. For the first time in years, she felt present in her own life. Carter ended his call and immediately started another. This time, it was his assistant, Sarah. I don't care if the meeting runs late. Tell them I'll join via video conference. Yes, from the restaurant if I have to. This deal closes tonight or heads will roll. Margaret flinched at his tone. She'd raised this man, taught him his first words, walked him through his first heartbreak. Somewhere along the way to building his empire, he'd forgotten how to be human. "Carter," she said softly, tentatively, "could we maybe talk? Just for a moment. It's my birthday, and I'd love to hear about your life. What you're working on. How you're doing." He held up one finger. "Wait," and continued his call. "Sarah, run the numbers again. If we can't get them below 42 million, the whole thing falls apart." Margaret's shoulders sagged. She turned her face away, toward the sound of the string quartet playing somewhere in the restaurant. Layla, approaching with their main courses, saw the moment for what it was. A mother being dismissed by the child she'd sacrificed everything for. The lamb was a masterpiece. Chef Antoine had outdone himself. The meat glistened under the restaurant's soft lighting, the herb crust perfectly caramelized. The pomisanna were golden and crisp. The plate was a work of art. Carter's steak was equally impressive, but he'd barely notice it. Layla set Carter's plate down first. Protocol demanded the gentleman be served first. He grunted acknowledgement without looking up from his phone. But when Layla approached Margaret with her lamb, she once again knelt beside the older woman's chair. "Mrs. Foster," Layla said gently, "your main course has arrived, and I have to tell you, Chef Antoine prepared this especially for you. He said to tell you that food should never just be fuel. It should be joy." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "He said that? For me?" "For you," Layla confirmed. She began describing the plate with even more care than before, noting the position of each element, the temperature, the textures. As she spoke, she noticed Margaret's breathing change, becoming deeper, more relaxed. But she also noticed Carter's jaw tightening. He'd ended his call and was watching them now with an expression Layla couldn't quite read. Irritation, impatience, something darker. "Is this really necessary?" Carter said suddenly, his voice sharp. "All this performance? Can't you just let her eat?" Margaret froze, mid-reach for her fork. Layla straightened slowly, maintaining her professional composure. "I'm simply ensuring your mother has the full dining experience, sir, as you requested at the beginning of the evening. I requested you describe the menu, not perform some kind of therapy session at our table. You've been hovering for 20 minutes. The restaurant seemed to grow quieter. Other diners were pretending not to listen, but several had stopped eating, their attention drawn by Carter's rising voice. Margaret's voice was barely audible. "Carter, please! She's been wonderful, don't—" "Mother, I'm paying for this meal. A very expensive meal, I might add. I'd appreciate if we could just eat it without all this drama." Layla felt her face flush. Every instinct told her to walk away, to apologize, to retreat into professional distance. That's what her training said to do. That's what restaurant protocol demanded. But then she looked at Margaret's face. The older woman looked stricken, embarrassed, like she'd done something wrong simply by accepting kindness. Her hands were shaking again. That same tremor Layla had noticed when she first approached their table. The light that had been growing in Margaret's expression throughout the meal was extinguishing, replaced by that familiar look of resigned isolation. And something inside Layla shifted. She thought of her grandmother, dying in a nursing home where efficiency was valued over dignity. She thought of her mother, working herself to exhaustion at 3 jobs to support her family. She thought of every person who'd ever been made to feel small by someone with power. She made a choice. Layla stood straight, her hands steady at her sides. She looked Carter Foster directly in the eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that had probably intimidated countless business rivals, destroyed careers, and closed billion-dollar deals without a flicker of conscience. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice calm but carrying through the quiet restaurant, "I wasn't performing therapy. I was serving your mother dinner with the dignity she deserves." The words hung in the air like smoke. Carter's face flushed red. "Excuse me, did you just—" "Your mother," Layla continued, her voice gaining strength, "is a person. A human being who happens to be blind. She's not a problem to be managed or an obligation to be checked off your list. She's someone who taught students for 37 years, who loved her late husband, who raised you. And tonight, on her birthday, she asked you for conversation, and you gave her phone calls about stock prices. The string quartet had stopped playing. The entire restaurant had gone silent. Waiters stood frozen mid-step. Even the sommelier, halfway through opening a bottle of wine at table 6, had paused to listen. Carter shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "How dare you speak to me that way? Do you have any idea who I am? I could buy this restaurant. I could have you fired with a single phone call." Margaret's voice was small, broken. "Carter, please, don't—" But Layla wasn't finished. Something had broken loose inside her. Years of watching people with wealth treat others as disposable. Years of swallowing her dignity to keep her job. Years of remaining silent when everything in her screamed to speak truth. "I know exactly who you are, sir," Layla said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You're Carter Foster. You're on the Forbes billionaire list. You've acquired 17 companies in the last 5 years. You're called the Vulture because you strip companies down and sell them for parts." Carter's eyes widened, surprised she knew these details. "But do you know what I also see?" Layla continued. "I see a man who brought his elderly mother to an expensive restaurant for her birthday and has spent the entire evening on his phone. I see a man who's too busy closing deals to notice his mother is lonely. I see a man who has everything money can buy but doesn't understand the one thing it can't." "And what's that?" Carter hissed, his voice dangerous. Layla glanced at Margaret, whose face was streaked with tears. "Decency, Mr. Foster. Money can't buy decency. It can't buy compassion. It can't buy the ability to see your own mother as a human being rather than an inconvenience." A hush fell over the restaurant, complete total silence. Not a fork moved, not a glass clinked. Even the kitchen sounds seemed to fade away. Every person in Marcella's was holding their breath, watching this young waitress stand up to one of New York's most powerful men. Margaret sat completely still, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of embarrassment or shame. They were something else entirely. Carter's breathing was heavy. His face had gone from red to nearly purple. "You just ended your career. I will make sure you never work in this city again. I will—" "That's enough." The voice came from across the restaurant. Everyone turned to see Patrice Fontaine herself, the owner of Marcella's, approaching table 12. Patrice was a formidable woman in her early 60s, silver-haired and elegant, with the bearing of someone who'd built her restaurant empire from nothing and wouldn't tolerate disrespect in her establishment, from staff or from customers. "Miss Fontaine," Carter started, but Patrice held up one hand. "Mr. Foster, I've been watching this situation unfold from the moment you walked in. I saw how you treated your mother. I saw how you've been on your phone through the entire meal. And I saw how Layla here did something we should all aspire to do. She treated another human being with kindness and respect." Carter opened his mouth to argue, but Patrice wasn't finished. "Your money is certainly appreciated, Mr. Foster, but it doesn't buy you the right to berate my staff or to sit in my restaurant and humiliate your own mother on her birthday. Layla Chen is one of the finest servers we've ever had, and I won't have you threatening her career because she dared to show your mother compassion." The applause started slowly. One person at table 7, the anniversary couple, then another at table 15. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was clapping. Some diners stood. The applause grew louder, thunderous, echoing off the high ceilings of Marcella's. Margaret sat with her hands pressed to her face, shoulders shaking with sobs. And Layla stood there, trembling, wondering if she'd just thrown away everything she'd worked for, but knowing somehow that it had been worth it. The applause faded slowly, like waves receding from shore. In its wake came an uncomfortable tension, the kind that follows a storm when everyone waits to see what damage has been done. Carter Foster stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that muscles jumped in his cheeks. His eyes darted around the restaurant, taking in the faces watching him, some sympathetic to the waitress, others merely curious about what would happen next. This was unfamiliar territory for him. In boardrooms and business deals, he controlled the narrative. Here, he'd lost control entirely. "This is unacceptable," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier venom. He was a man accustomed to intimidation working, and when it didn't, he seemed almost lost. "I came here for a quiet dinner with my mother, and instead I'm being lectured by the staff and humiliated in front of—" "Carter." Margaret's voice cut through his complaints. It was quiet, but something in her tone made him stop. "Please, just stop." He turned to look at his mother, and for the first time all evening really seemed to see her. She was crying, but she'd lowered her hands from her face. Her unseeing eyes were wet with tears, but her expression wasn't one of embarrassment or distress. It was something else, relief perhaps, or release. "Mother, I'm handling this. This woman was completely out of line." "No, she wasn't." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "She was the first person in 3 years who made me feel like I still exist, like I'm still worth something. Do you understand that? Since your father died, since I lost my sight, I've been invisible, even to you, especially to you." Carter's face went pale. "That's not fair. I brought you here, didn't I? To the best restaurant in Manhattan, for your birthday. You brought me here and then ignored me for 2 hours while you talked about business deals," Margaret said. And now her voice was shaking, not with weakness, but with long-suppressed emotion. "This young woman, Layla, she spent 20 minutes making me feel human again, making me remember what it's like to enjoy food, to feel joy, to be seen, and you're angry at her for it?" The restaurant was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. People weren't watching a spectacle anymore. They were witnessing something intimate and painful, a family confrontation that had probably been years in the making. Patrice Fontaine stood with her arms crossed, watching carefully but saying nothing. She'd said her piece. This was now between mother and son. Layla remained near the table, unsure whether to stay or retreat. Her legs felt weak, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She'd never done anything like this before, never stood up to a customer, never risked her job for principle. Her hands trembled slightly. Carter seemed to be struggling with something, his face working through emotions he clearly wasn't comfortable expressing. "I work hard, Mother. Everything I do to make sure you're taken care of. The best doctors, the best care." "I don't need the best doctors," Margaret interrupted. "I need my son. I need someone to talk to me, not at me, to see me as more than a problem to be solved with money." She reached out blindly toward where she thought he might be standing. "I'm lonely, Carter. I'm so terribly lonely, and you're the only family I have left." Something cracked in Carter's expression. For just a moment the cold businessman facade slipped, and underneath was a lost man who'd forgotten how to connect with the person who'd raised him. But then his phone buzzed. A reflex he'd developed over years in business. His hand moved automatically toward his pocket. "Don't," Margaret said quietly. "Please, just this once. Don't answer it." Carter's hand froze. The phone continued to buzz. Once, twice, 3 times, then it stopped. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Finally, Carter sat down. Slowly, heavily, like a man carrying an enormous weight. He didn't speak, didn't look at anyone. He just sat there, his expensive suit suddenly looking like armor that had failed to protect him. Margaret reached across the table tentatively, searching for her son's hand. After a long moment, he took it. Layla stepped back quietly, giving them space. She caught Marcus's eye across the restaurant. He gave her a subtle nod of approval. Several diners smiled at her as she passed their tables, one woman squeezing her arm in solidarity. But Layla's heart was still pounding. She'd crossed a line tonight, had spoken truth in a way that could have destroyed her career, still might destroy it, depending on what happened next. As she reached the kitchen, Chef Antoine was waiting, his eyes full of questions. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Layla leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. "I think I just did something either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both." Layla stayed in the kitchen for several minutes, trying to calm her racing heart. Other servers moved around her, preparing dishes, checking orders, but they gave her a wide berth, sensing she needed space to process what had just happened. Finally, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Layla, table 12 is asking for you." Her stomach dropped. To complain? Marcus's expression was unreadable. "I don't think so, but you should probably go see." She took a deep breath, straightened her vest, and walked back into the dining room. The atmosphere had shifted. The string quartet had resumed playing, but more softly than before. Conversations had restarted at other tables, though several diners were still glancing toward table 12 with obvious curiosity. As Layla approached, she saw that Carter and Margaret were talking. Actually talking. Their hands were still joined across the table, and Carter's phone lay face down on the white tablecloth, deliberately set aside. Margaret's face was still wet with tears, but she was speaking animatedly about something. And Carter was listening, not with his usual impatient half-attention, but really listening, leaning forward slightly, his expression focused on his mother. Layla hesitated, not wanting to interrupt, but Margaret's head turned toward the sound of her footsteps. "Layla?" Margaret asked. "Is that you?" "Yes, Mrs. Foster, I'm here. Please, come closer." Margaret reached out with her free hand. "I wanted to thank you. What you did tonight, what you said to my son. I've been wanting to say those things for 3 years, but I didn't have the courage." Layla glanced at Carter, expecting hostility, but his expression was complicated, embarrassed perhaps, but also something softer, ashamed. "I'm glad I could help, Mrs. Foster," Layla said carefully, "though I apologize if I overstepped any boundaries." Carter cleared his throat. "You didn't overstep." The words seemed to cost him something to say. "You were right. About everything." He looked up at Layla, and his eyes were red-rimmed. "I haven't been present, not just tonight, but for years. My father died, and I threw myself into work because it was easier than dealing with grief. And then when my mother lost her sight, I did the same thing, hired nurses, paid for everything, but never actually showed up." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You're showing up now." There was a long pause. The vulnerability in Carter's face was startling. This man, who'd built an empire on ruthless decisiveness, suddenly looked lost and uncertain. "My lamb is getting cold," Margaret said gently, breaking the tension. "And I'd very much like to finish it. Would you describe it to me, Carter, the way Layla did?" Carter looked panicked. "I don't know how. I'm not good with words like that." "Try," Margaret encouraged. He picked up his fork, cut a small piece of Margaret's lamb, and tasted it himself. For a moment he was silent, and Layla could see him genuinely trying to experience the food rather than just consume it. "It's tender," he began haltingly, "very tender. And there's herbs. Rosemary, like you used to grow in our garden in Westchester, when I was a kid." His voice caught. "Before Dad died, before everything changed." Margaret's face transformed. "Yes, just like that. Keep going. The meat is pink in the middle, still juicy, and there's this crust on the outside that's," he struggled for words, "crispy, It has this smell like Sunday dinners when I was young, when you and Dad would cook together and the whole house smelled like a celebration. Tears were flowing freely down Margaret's face now, but she was smiling. That's perfect, Carter. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Layla felt her own eyes stinging. She'd witnessed something shifting between them, years of distance beginning to close, connection being rebuilt one awkward description at a time. Carter continued, gaining confidence. The potatoes are layered thin, each bite crunches then melts, and there's butter. A lot of butter. He almost smiled. You'd probably tell me it's too much butter, that I should eat healthier. Margaret laughed, actually laughed. I probably would. But tonight, I don't care. Tonight, I just want to enjoy my birthday dinner with my son. They ate together, Carter occasionally describing elements of the meal, getting better at it as he went. Layla checked on them periodically, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, but mostly staying back to give them privacy. At one point, the woman from Table 7, the anniversary couple, approached Layla as she passed. "What you did earlier," the woman whispered, "was one of the bravest things I've ever seen. My mother had dementia before she died, and people treated her like she'd stopped being a person. You reminded me that everyone deserves dignity. Thank you." Similar comments came throughout the evening. A businessman at Table 9 left her a $100 tip with a note for having the courage to speak truth. The elderly couple from Table 15 stopped by before leaving to tell her she'd restored their faith in humanity. But the most meaningful moment came near the end of the evening. Carter requested the check, and when Layla brought it, he looked at it for a long moment before reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his wallet and extracted several crisp $100 bills. "The tip," he said quietly, not looking at her directly, "isn't nearly enough for what you did tonight. You gave me back something I'd lost, something I didn't even realize was missing." Layla started to protest. The amount was excessive, probably 3 times what the entire meal cost, but Carter held up a hand. "Please, accept it, and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry. For how I treated you. For how I treated my mother. You were right about everything, and I should have heard it years ago." "Thank you, Mr. Foster," Layla said softly. "That means more than the money." Margaret stood, and Carter immediately moved to her side, offering his arm. She took it, and together they walked slowly toward the restaurant's exit. Before they reached the door, Margaret stopped and turned back toward where she'd last heard Layla's voice. "Layla Chen," Margaret called out, "I won't forget you, and neither will my son." The door closed behind them, leaving Layla standing in the middle of Marcella's, holding an envelope full of money and feeling like her entire world had shifted on its axis. Layla woke the next morning to her phone vibrating continuously on her nightstand. She groaned, squinting at the screen through sleep-blurred eyes. 6:47 a.m. on a Sunday. Who was texting her at this hour? Then she saw the notifications, hundreds of them. Text messages, missed calls, social media mentions, email alerts, all flooding in simultaneously. Her phone's battery was at 12% from the overnight onslaught. Confused and still half asleep, she opened Twitter. Her breath caught. The top trending hashtag in New York was #decency not dollars. Below it, Marcella's waitress and Layla Chen, though they'd misspelled her name. "What on earth?" she muttered, scrolling frantically. Someone had recorded last night's confrontation. A diner must have pulled out their phone when voices were raised, capturing the moment Layla stood up to Carter Foster. The video was grainy, the audio not perfect, but clear enough. Clear enough to hear Layla say, "Money can't buy decency, Mr. Foster. It can't buy compassion. It can't buy the ability to see your own mother as a human being rather than an inconvenience." The video had been posted at 11:43 p.m. the previous night. In less than 9 hours, It had been viewed 2.3 million times. Layla's hands trembled as she read through the comments. Thousands of them, pouring in from across the country. Finally, someone told a billionaire the truth. This waitress has more integrity than most politicians. I'm crying. My mum is blind too, and people treat her like she's invisible. This matters. Carter Foster is the worst. Good for this woman standing up to him. But there were negative comments too. She was completely unprofessional. Servers shouldn't lecture customers. Easy to be righteous when you're not the one losing your job. This is why I hate Gen Z. No respect for authority. Layla felt dizzy. She stumbled to her small kitchen where her mother was already up, making breakfast. Her younger sister, Maya, was at the table, staring at her laptop. "Layla!" Maya shouted, jumping up. "You're famous! You're all over TikTok!" "What?" Layla's mother turned, spatula in hand. "What's happening?" Maya spun her laptop around. There were TikTok reaction videos, people watching Layla's confrontation with Carter, their faces showing shock, then admiration, then applause. One video had 800,000 likes, another had been stitched with commentary from a social worker praising Layla's advocacy for disability dignity. Layla sank into a chair. This can't be happening. Her phone rang. Marcus, the maitre d' from Marcella's. "Layla, have you seen—" "Yes," she interrupted. "I've seen. Patrice wants to speak with you. Can you come in this morning, as soon as possible?" Her stomach dropped. "Am I being fired?" "No! God, no, just come in. Trust me." An hour later, Layla stood in Patrice Fontaine's private office above the restaurant. The space was elegant but understated. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, tasteful art on the walls, a desk that probably cost more than Layla's annual salary. Patrice sat behind that desk, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression warm. "Sit down, Layla, please." Layla sat, her heart hammering. "I assume you've seen the video," Patrice began. "Yes, ma'am." "And you're worried about your job?" "I shouldn't have spoken to a customer that way, I know that. I just—" Patrice held up a hand. "What you did last night was remarkable. Not just brave, but necessary. That man needed to hear the truth, and you delivered it with grace under pressure." She leaned forward. "My phone has been ringing all morning. News outlets wanting interviews. The New York Times wants to write a feature. Good Morning America's producers called twice." Layla's eyes widened. "What?" "You've struck a nerve, Layla. People are tired of watching the wealthy treat service workers as disposable. They're tired of disability being invisible. Your moment with Margaret Foster and your confrontation with her son, it resonated with millions of people." "I don't want to be famous," Layla said quickly. "I just wanted to help Mrs. Foster enjoy her dinner." "I know. That's exactly why this matters." Patrice pulled out a folder. "I've had 3 calls this morning from disability rights organizations. They want you to speak at events. There's a foundation that promotes dignity in service work. They're offering you a position as an ambassador." She paused. "And Carter Foster called me an hour ago." Layla's blood ran cold. "To complain, to apologize. To me, to you, if you'll take his call, and apparently to his mother more extensively. The video humiliated him publicly, but according to him, it also woke him up. He's taking a leave of absence from his company to focus on his family." Layla couldn't speak. Her mind was reeling. "You have choices to make," Patrice continued. "You can stay here at Marcella's, with a raise, I might add. You can pursue these opportunities. You can do both. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that what you did last night represents everything this restaurant should stand for, human dignity above all else." Layla's phone buzzed again. Another notification, another 1,000 shares. Her one moment of courage had somehow become a movement, spreading across the internet like wildfire, touching people she'd never meet, inspiring conversations about respect, disability, family, and the power of standing up for what's right. She thought of Margaret Foster's face when Carter finally held her hand. That was worth everything, even this overwhelming tsunami of attention. "Can I think about it?" Layla asked quietly. Patrice smiled. "Take all the time you need. But Layla, don't be surprised when people start recognizing you on the street. You're not just a waitress anymore. Whether you wanted it or not, you've become a symbol of something important." As Layla left the office, her phone rang again. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her press accept. "Hello? Layla, this is Margaret Foster. I hope it's all right that I'm calling. Carter gave me your number. I wanted to tell you something important." Layla stepped into a quiet corner of the restaurant's exterior courtyard, pressing her phone closer to her ear. "Mrs. Foster? Of course it's all right. How are you?" Margaret's voice was warm, stronger than it had been the night before. "I'm wonderful, actually. Better than I've been in years. Carter and I talked until 3 in the morning. Really talked for the first time since his father died. And it's all because of you." "I'm so glad," Layla said, feeling tears prick her eyes. "But that's not why I'm calling," Margaret continued. "I saw the video. Well, Carter described it to me. You're everywhere, dear. And I wanted you to know that what you said wasn't just true for my son. It's true for all of us. Money can't buy decency. It can't buy compassion. But sometimes someone speaking up can remind us what we've lost sight of." She paused, and Layla heard her take a breath. "I called because I want to tell you something important. After I lost my sight, I stopped living. I thought my life was over, that I'd become a burden, that my purpose was gone. But last night you made me feel seen in a way I haven't felt in 3 years, not with pity but with genuine respect." "You deserved that," Layla said softly. "So does everyone else," Margaret replied, "which is why I've decided to do something about it. Carter and I are starting a foundation together for people who've lost their sight later in life, to help them maintain their dignity, their independence, their joy, and we'd like you to be part of it if you're willing." Layla's breath caught. "Mrs. Foster, I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. Say you'll use this platform you've accidentally gained to keep speaking up for people who feel invisible." Margaret's voice grew tender. "You have a gift, Layla. You see people, really see them. That's rarer than you know." They talked for 15 more minutes, making tentative plans, exchanging promises to stay in touch. When Layla finally hung up, she found Marcus waiting nearby with a knowing smile. "Good news?" he asked. "Overwhelming news," Layla corrected. "But yes, good." 3 months later, Layla stood on a stage at the Javits Center in Manhattan, speaking to an audience of 2,000 people at the National Disability Rights Conference. She'd reduced her hours at Marcella's, but hadn't quit. She loved the work, loved the daily interactions, the small moments of connection with diners. But now she also traveled, speaking about dignity in service work, about seeing people with disabilities as whole human beings, about the courage it takes to speak truth to power. Margaret Foster sat in the front row, Carter beside her. He'd taken a 6-month leave from his company and was using the time to rebuild his relationship with his mother and to co-chair their new foundation. The media had dubbed him the changed vulture, and while some skeptics questioned the sincerity of his transformation, those who knew him saw real change. As Layla spoke, she saw faces in the crowd, people wiping tears, nodding in recognition, feeling seen. She talked about her grandmother, about Margaret, about all the invisible people in plain sight who just needed someone to acknowledge their humanity. The video from that night at Marcella's had been viewed over 20 million times. It sparked documentaries, inspired policy changes in disability accommodation laws, and launched a national conversation about how wealth and power can blind people to basic human decency. But for Layla, the most important impact was simpler. It was in the letters she received from servers who'd found courage to stand up to abusive customers, from people with disabilities who felt less invisible, from adult children who'd called their aging parents for the first time in months. It was in Margaret Foster's smile when Carter visited her 3 times a week now, instead of 3 times a year, in the way he'd learned to describe the world to her, not out of obligation, but out of love. After her speech, a young woman approached Layla, tears streaming down her face. "My mother has macular degeneration. She stopped going out because she was embarrassed. But after seeing your video, after hearing you speak, I realized I've been treating her the way that Billionaire treated his mum, not seeing her. Tomorrow, I'm taking her to her favorite restaurant, and I'm going to really be present." Layla hugged her, thinking about how one moment, one decision to speak up could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. That night, back in her Queen's apartment, Layla's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Thank you for giving me back my son, and for reminding the world that every person deserves to be seen." Layla typed her response. "Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply treat each other with dignity." She set her phone down and looked around her small apartment, the same cramped space, but everything felt different now. She'd learned something profound that night at Marcella's, that speaking truth didn't require wealth or power or position. It only required courage and conviction. Money couldn't buy decency, but decency freely given could change the world. Sometimes it takes just one sentence, one moment of courage to remind us all what truly matters. Thank you for reading this story. If it touched you, consider how you might see the invisible people in your own life and have the courage to speak up when others don't.